Before we begin our journey on this peaceful night, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always delightful to discover where our listeners rest their heads as they travel with us through these old memories. The soup of yesterday and the day before that. There was a time when my village seemed to revolve around a single cauldron. Yes, just one, large, old, darkened by constant fire and bubbling day and night in the corner of the Crooked Cedar Tavern. It wasn't the kind of soup made at home, with precise measurements and carefully chosen herbs. This was something else entirely, something alive almost. No one really knew when the broth had first started to boil. Some said it dated back to the king's last visit. Others swore it had been simmering since the days when wolves still prowled the village square. What mattered was that it had never been fully emptied. Each new ingredient sank into a past of blended flavors and forgotten intentions. At the first spoonful, the uninitiated would wrinkle their noses. It was a taste one couldn't describe without making a face, something between stale turnip and the memory of bone. But those who braved a second spoonful usually came back the next day. Maybe it was the warmth, maybe the ritual, or perhaps it was the way the steam curled into the wooden beams of the ceiling, as if telling stories with every spiral. I remember the soup was always the same, but never identical. A soggy piece of bread here, a strand of cabbage there, a bone someone claimed was chicken, but others suggested was, well, best not to know. They said the secret was in the continuity. The cauldron was never scrubbed, only replenished, an eternal cycle of leftovers and hope. Master Raoul, the innkeeper, tended to the fire like one tends an altar. Sometimes at dawn I'd see him toss in a handful of salt with his eyes closed, as if whispering a prayer. And when asked about the ingredients, he would simply smile with the corner of his mouth and say, "It has everything, except haste." It was the kind of answer that didn't satisfy curiosity, but made the soup even more mysterious. And what characters came to taste that broth? Farmers caked in mud, young women with hands raw from washing laundry in the river, a blacksmith who only showed up on the coldest nights, and even Friar Domenico, who always said a prayer before drinking, not out of piety but precaution. Some swore the soup cured colds, others said it cured loneliness, but deep down everyone knew the truth. It only cured an empty stomach, and not always gently. One night, a stranger walked into the tavern during a thick frost, shaking off his coat like he was driving away evil spirits. He sat near the cauldron and, upon seeing the thick soup being served with a ladle more fit for masonry, raised his eyebrows. "This is food," he muttered, unaware that every eye was now on him. Master Raoul, with all the solemnity the moment demanded, simply said, "It's the soup from yesterday. And the day before that." A reverent silence followed, as if he'd recited a sacred verse. The stranger took a spoonful and choked, then coughed, then asked for more. That's how it worked. The soup didn't ask for approval, it asked for habit. In time, one stopped noticing the taste and began to recognize its variations. Some days were more bitter, when it rained and vegetables were scarce. Some days were greasy, when a butcher had contributed a hearty bone. And then there were strangely sweet days, which no one could explain, but everyone agreed to forget. There was a silent consensus, better not to ask too much. It was like life there, never perfect, but always warm. Some of the village children, myself included, used to play a game guessing the week's ingredient. We'd sit around the cauldron, cheeks flushed with heat and nostrils full of steam, trying to tell if the flavor came from leeks or some more exotic, and sometimes frightening, root. One time I swore I tasted burnt apple, and my friend Brigida insisted she saw an eggshell floating among the bits of bread. It was like a game of taste memory, where each spoonful was a ticket to the past, or to peril. The elders, however, took it very seriously. Donna Sancha, well past 80, claimed the soup kept her bones firm, And my tongue sharp, she'd add, winking. Old Tilo said the cauldron held the flavors of every harvest and winter in the village's history, and for that, it was sacred. Once a month, he'd drop in a handful of dried herbs and chant a quiet litany. No one interrupted. It was as if the cauldron, with its thick crust and lazy bubbles, listened patiently to every word. Not everyone shared that reverence, of course. There were those who turned up their noses, especially the youth who dreamed of other lands and other flavors. I remember the apothecary's nephew who stayed with us for a month and scoffed, saying it was just leftover soup with no soul or recipe. Raoul merely laughed and replied, "But it has memory, and that's worth more than soul." The boy didn't understand. He returned to the city before the month was up, and we never saw him again. But the soup, it stayed, steady, like a clock without hands, marking the rhythm of village life. In the harshest winters, when fields lay under frost and gardens fell silent, it was the soup that brought us together. People who barely spoke sat side by side, holding steaming bowls, eyes fogged by the rising vapor, sharing crusty bread as if at a feast. On such days, the soup seemed to deepen in flavor, perhaps from the cold, perhaps from the hush that comes before snow. All I know is that comfort lived there, even when the ingredients were humble. Hunger, after all, has no pride, but memory does. Sometimes, when there was a bit more meat, a rare occasion, Raoul would announce with glee, "We've got chunks today," and everyone's eyes would sparkle as if it were a celebration. But even when there was nothing but water, salt, and unrecognizable remnants of what used to be turnip, no one failed to come. It wasn't really about flavor nor faith. It was about habit, like lighting a candle before bed or covering the saint's face before a storm. The soup was part of what made us feel that we belonged. I grew up, of course, and over time, I began leaving the village. Short trips, errands to other markets, once even to the big city. There, I tasted broths clear, thick, fragrant, exotic, and all of them felt strange. They lacked something, a kind of silence, perhaps, or that old flavor that couldn't be named. When I returned, already an adult, I stepped into the Crooked Cedar Tavern on a cold afternoon, and there it was. The cauldron, smaller now maybe, with time-worn cracks along its rim, but still alive. Raoul was gone, but one of his sons stirred the broth with the same care. I sat on the same bench as always, the one beneath the crooked beam where the smoke rose slower, as if tired. The soup was served without ceremony, a generous ladleful, a piece of hard bread beside it, and I brought it to my lips like greeting an old friend. The taste, the taste was the same and not the same. A trace of time that hadn't been there before, the absence of onion that only someone who'd tasted that soup for countless winters would notice. Yet still, it was her, always her, the soup of yesterday, and the day before that. I sat there, watching the tavern's bustle. Children laughing, old men dozing near the brazier, a freckled girl humming softly while drying glasses. Everything looked the same, but I knew it wasn't. The world had changed, the people had changed. But the cauldron, and what it meant, remained. And in that moment, with the bowl in my hands and the steam rising like a silent prayer, I understood. Not every tradition is made of words. Some live in smells, in broths, in memories shared by the fire. Later that evening, when night had fallen and the candles were lit one by one, I saw one of the younger boys approach the cauldron with curious eyes. He held something between his fingers, a plum pit perhaps, and, unnoticed by anyone, let it fall into the broth with a solemn gesture. No one laughed, no one scolded. That was part of the ritual, a small gesture, yet full of intention. That's how the soup continued to be made, not by recipe, but by layers of life, of absence, of trying. And each gesture, no matter how trivial, left its invisible mark behind. That night, as I returned home, I felt something within me settle. It wasn't just a full belly. It was a heart nourished by memory. And as I lay under the blankets, I thought about how certain flavors follow us forever, even when we can no longer tell them apart on the tongue. Perhaps the village soup was never meant to heal the body, as some claimed, nor to nourish the soul, as others believed. Perhaps it existed solely to remind us that, even in the hardest of times, something warm will always be waiting. Something simple yet constant, like the gesture of coming back. And it's curious to think that of all the delicacies I've ever tasted, none remains so vivid in my memory as that shapeless mix of leftovers, boiled until it lost all pretense. Perhaps because there was no vanity in it, no secret, only a quiet persistence. The soup didn't care to be beautiful nor delicious. It simply was. And that was enough, like certain villagers who spent their days sweeping the courtyard or spinning wool, never expecting applause, but whose absence, when it came, left a silence no one knew how to fill. Today, when I tell this story, some smile with disbelief, amused by the idea of the endless soup or doubting it ever existed. But that's all right. Not all truths need to be proven. Some live only in the way one's eyes drift while remembering, or in how the mouth, even in silence, seems to search for a taste only memory knows how to offer. And if by chance on some cold night you come across a soup whose flavor feels strange, yet strangely familiar, perhaps, just perhaps, you're in the presence of a tradition far older than you imagine. And so, as long as there is someone willing to stir a cauldron with patience, to toss in a vegetable peel with care, or to serve a bowl with a quiet smile in the corner of the eyes, this story will remain alive. Not in books, perhaps, nor in prayers, but in the simple act of feeding another, not with feasts, but with constancy. Because in the end, the soup of yesterday, and the day before that, was never about food. It was about staying, about enduring the winters, the scarcity, the rush of the world, and that indeed is what truly nourishes us. So if one day you feel the world spinning too fast, with everything changing before it can be understood, seek a place where something still bubbles slowly, where time lingers in steam and flavor doesn't come from spices, but from silence and memory. You may not find a cauldron like ours, but with a bit of luck, you'll find the same comfort, warm, imperfect, and endlessly familiar. The barber and the bucket. I recall with a certain nostalgic shiver the figure of Master Bastien, the barber of our village. His shop was a damp little room tucked behind the mill, where the scent of rancid oil, mint, and rusted iron lingered in the air like an ancestral mist. The stools were crooked stumps of wood, and the mirror, a polished shard nailed crookedly to the wall, distorted more than it reflected. There, among dull scissors, blacksmith's pliers, and a metal bucket that never quite dried, miracles and disasters took place, and a whole range of interventions that, through modern eyes, would seem almost theatrical. It was common to see a line of men and animals at the half-open door, each one waiting their turn with an expression that blended faith and resignation. Master Bastien was not only the village barber, he was also the dentist, the bloodletter, the healer of boils, the hoof trimmer, and according to some, a makeshift exorcist when tempers ran high. With his grimy apron and ever-present bucket by his side, he tended to everyone with the same care and the same tools, which he cleaned with a damp cloth and a whispered prayer. No one knew whether he had learned the trade from someone else, or if life itself had taught him to do what needed doing with whatever was at hand. Once, I came to him to trim my beard, which had grown unruly like late summer weeds. I sat on the usual stump, feeling the chill of the bucket's metal brushing against my ankle, and I noticed it already held something inside, something dark and vaguely viscous. Bastien smiled with his few remaining teeth and began sharpening the razor on a strip of leather hanging from the ceiling beam. "She's in the mood to work today," he said, as if the blade had a will of its own. The cut was quick, uneven, and left a subtle sting on the skin, which he soothed with a compress of vinegar and rue leaves pulled from the same pocket where he kept coins and breadcrumbs. But it wasn't beard trimming that made him famous. It was the bloodletting. When someone complained of dizziness, fever, or even melancholy, there he was, grave-faced, diagnosing bad heat or a spirit trapped in the blood. With a quick, precise flick of the blade, he would let relief flow, murmuring proverbs he had picked up by ear, better out now than haunting later. Many truly believed that leaving lighter, even if only in blood, meant the healing had begun. Others, like my uncle Osorio, used to say that merely walking out alive was the real miracle. There was also the famous case of Donna Michelina, who went to him with a toothache that had kept her awake for 3 moons. Master Bastien, with the solemnity of a bishop, examined her mouth with a wooden spoon, asked her to hold a raw potato in her hands. To absorb the fright, he said, and with a sharp snap pulled out the wrong tooth. Her scream echoed all the way to the corral. Yet oddly, a few days later, the pain vanished completely, as if it had been yanked out along with the healthy tooth. From that day on, she visited him not out of need, but out of gratitude. She said that even when he missed, he hit, in the way only saints and barbers could. Ah, the bucket, always present, like a profane chalice where mixtures of water, blood, vinegar, bits of cotton, and occasionally a stray tooth or nail would rest. They said it was never washed, only emptied when the moon commanded. For the more superstitious, that was part of the secret, that the bottom of the bucket held some ancient knowledge, a kind of liquid memory of the ailments it had cured. No one dared touch it, except Bastien, who treated it with almost ceremonial respect. One morning, a child tried to peek inside, but was stopped by a look so stern, he cried for 2 days. Behind all the strangeness, there was a quiet trust that held the village together. Everyone knew Master Bastien wasn't infallible, far from it, but he carried in his calloused hands a rare kind of courage, the kind that tries to help even without certainty, and that, for many, was comfort enough. There was a winter when half the village fell ill with a bad wind from the south. Those who could still walk went to the barber. He bled some, gave onion and garlic tea to others, and applied a compress of ashes and honey to those with high fevers. Some improved, others worsened, but no one blamed him. In those days, hope was the most precious medicine, and he dispensed it generously. The most extraordinary thing is that despite all the tales of fright, pain, and flying teeth, Master Bastien's chair never stayed empty for long. Maybe out of fear, maybe out of habit, or perhaps because of a deep-rooted faith that made us accept that a little suffering was the price of healing. Some paid with coins, others with eggs or favors, but all left with the same cloth tied around their necks and the same final instruction: rest and let the body think. He said it with such seriousness that no one dared disobey, as if the body really could decide its own fate, as long as it was given good advice. There was also the day a goat was brought to him with a swollen hoof. The animal's owner, desperate, claimed he was the only one who could save Little One, though the creature looked more like a small ox than anything little. Without hesitation, Bastien dipped his razor in the bucket, the same one, of course, and gently scraped the hoof, murmuring fragmented words that sounded like blessings or spells. Then he applied a paste of charcoal, salt, and child's urine. An old recipe, he explained, and bound it with a clean rag. 3 days later, Little One was walking as if nothing had happened, sealing the barber's reputation as a healing hand, even among the four-legged. But not everything was a success. There were nights when Bastien misjudged a move, or the blade struck a nerve too close. In those moments, he simply made the sign of the cross, offered a stale piece of bread with herbs, and said that Some pains come from far away and need time to leave. No one argued. Instead, families brought their sick to him like offerings to a crooked altar, not for certainty of healing, but for the comfort of trying something, anything. And that was enough for many hearts trembling before the unknown. Over time, I came to realize that Master Bastio's true gift wasn't the blade or the improvised diagnoses. It was the silence he offered between one procedure and the next. While wiping his hands on a cloth stained by decades or filling the bucket from the well, never curiously emptying it completely, he listened. He listened with half-closed eyes, as if reading between the lines more than the words. Many left there, not just a tooth or a bit of blood, but also the worries no one else was willing to hear. And somehow, they left lighter. During a particularly rainy spring, a young woman appeared at his door, a stranger from another village. Her face was veiled, and her voice as faint as mist. She said her chest ached with no clear cause. Bastien looked at her for a long moment, asked her to sit, and without touching any blades or herbs, simply offered her a warm infusion and held her hand for a long, quiet moment. No one knew what else happened. But later that week, she was seen smiling at the market, buying colorful ribbons. Sometimes that was it, a quiet gesture, a shared tea that healed more than everything in the bucket. There was something ancestral in the way he inhabited his craft, as if his knowledge came from a time before words. He never called himself a healer, nor a doctor, simply barber, with a certain tired pride. But anyone who watched him closely could see that his eyes carried the weight of many winters, and perhaps too many failures. Even so, there was tenderness in his movements. When a child cried before a haircut, he would tell stories about ants wearing socks or moons hiding behind mustaches. It was his way of distracting from pain, and of reminding us that no matter how rough the world became, there was still room for laughter between the splinters. The bucket, of course, always remained by his side. Over time it began to gain an almost mythical status among the elders. Some swore that if you looked into it under the full moon's reflection, you could see the face of the one you loved most. Others said it was where Bastien spoke with the souls of those he had treated, as if every drop inside held a liquid memory. Once, during an eclipse, a group of children tried to steal it to see the bottom of the bottom, but fled in terror when the bucket, perched atop a stone, toppled on its own with a sharp clang like a warning. That night, no one slept well. As the years passed, Bastien's body bent like a branch beneath snow, but his hands remained steady and the bucket never changed owners. He himself used to say that when his time came, he wanted no grave, no candles, only that they bury the bucket at the foot of the crooked tree beside the chapel, so the old knowledge could return to the earth. And so it was. I remember the day clearly. A calm dusk, with a breeze scented by wild lavender, when men and women walked silently along the dirt path, carrying the old bucket wrapped in a white cloth, as if it were a reliquary. Since then, the little shop has stood empty. The herbs dried on the ceiling hooks, and the fogged mirrors reflect nothing but the time that has passed. Yet now and then, when someone in the village feels a nameless ache or a tightness that no tea or prayer can soothe, there are those who go to the crooked tree and sit there for a while. They say that if the wind blows just right, you can hear the soft metallic clink of an imaginary bucket and a raspy voice murmuring, "Rest, let the body think," and somehow that is enough. Clothes turned inside out. The memory that visits me today arrived with the cold breath of wind, squeezing through the cracks in the window, carrying with it a long-forgotten scent of damp wool and burnt wood. It was always at the beginning of winter that the house seemed to shrink. The floorboards creaked louder, the blankets grew heavier with time, and the voices inside grew softer, as if saving words might also help conserve warmth. In those days, The whole world seemed made of soup steam, hearth smoke, and the silence that comes before the frost. I remember the brown tunic everyone recognized as mine, not because it was pretty, but because it had molded its weight to my body like a second skin. It was thick, rough, and by the end of the second week, it held more stories than any book in the village. Each morning, I would turn it inside out with a solemn, almost ceremonial gesture, as if restarting a cycle. It wasn't a matter of style, it was a strategy for survival. The inside of the garment was like a second breath, an attempt to disguise the inevitable without relying on the rarity of warm water or the luxury of a bar of soap. There was a certain art to the act of flipping the tunic. First, you gave it a firm shake, not to clean it, for that would be overly optimistic, but to dislodge breadcrumbs, bits of straw, and perhaps scare off any spirits clinging to the embedded scent. Then it was turned carefully, aligning the thick seams so the fabric wouldn't tear completely, and there it was. A new side of the same clothing, a new disguise for the same aroma. At the table, my mother used to say the secret was never mentioning it. Whoever spoke of the smell was the first to be noticed by it. It was a silent game, almost respectful. Father had worn the same wool cloak since before I was born, and he swore that body heat was more important than freshness. "Cold kills quicker than stench," he'd say, adjusting his collar while the vapor from his breath mingled with the smoke from the wood-burning stove. My sister, more vain, sometimes hung her blouse outside overnight, hoping the dew might grant it a bath of mercy. But when the wind returned, freezing even the most stubborn thread of courage, she would wear it again, cold, stiff, and smile as if it were the cleanest garment in the village. The entire village, in fact, shared this tacit pact of fragrant ignorance. On market mornings, the inside-out clothes multiplied like an inverted army, with protruding seams, faded tags, and mysterious stains no one dared question. The butcher wore an apron that seemed made of leather and dried seasoning, while the blacksmith flaunted sleeves hardened with soot and grease, clinking like armor. And yet there was dignity in it all. A kind of pride in surviving another winter without yielding to vanity, as if the strong smell were an invisible medal pinned to the chest. Once, Donna Fina, the midwife, tried to convince us to boil the clothes with mint leaves. She said the steam would release the evil spirits and the odor too. The idea sounded promising, until the smell of boiled wool spread through the house like an ancestral insult. The result was a tunic that smelled like spoiled tea and was even stiffer than before. We returned to the old ways, flip it inside out, ignore it, and carry on. Sometimes tradition is less about what works and more about what keeps us together. What was most curious was how the nose seemed to give in over time, like a dog that stops barking at the inevitable. After the first week, we no longer distinguished the smell of our clothes from the scent of the house, and by the second, it was as if everything belonged to the same fabric. Walls, blankets, pillows, even the air seemed dressed in that same aged tunic. And so, accustomed to ourselves, we spent the days wrapped in a cloud of human warmth, burnt wood, and something that vaguely resembled old cheese. No one complained. And if anyone dared, they were reminded that last year the cold took 3 of Uncle Raoul's toes, but not a single button fell from his tunic. At the village school, the students had their own tricks. Some swore that rubbing garlic under the arms would drive away the smell and the people, long enough to earn some space by the fireplace. Others sewed tiny pouches of herbs into their sleeves, creating an olfactory illusion that lasted until the first sneeze. I personally like to keep a dried apple peel in my pocket. It didn't scent anything, but the gesture kept me company, a reminder of autumn already gone. In times of such silence and cold, little rituals like that made the weeks feel less coarse. Visits were rare during the frozen months, but when they happened, there was a rehearsed choreography, shake out the rugs, hang fresh towels over the old ones, scatter a handful of cloves across the table, and of course, flip all the clothes to their most acceptable side. My mother used to say that hospitality was a form of courage. After all, it took boldness to welcome someone when not even your own scent could be trusted. Still, we laughed together when guests mentioned the house's welcoming air. The truth was, no one had the nerve to say otherwise with hot soup in their hands. Sometimes, at night, we would hear the fabrics crackle in the dark, stiffened by time and layered days. I imagined each sound as a small memory trapped in the tunic's folds. The day I fell into the river, the bread I hid in my pocket, my grandmother's embrace, she who wore the same shawl for 20 winters. And then I would fall asleep, wrapped in that rough cocoon, my face pressed against a protruding seam, breathing in the scent of the world that raised me. It was strange to think that what some might call filth, to us was history. And time, patient as ever, stitched every stain like someone writing without ink. The cold in those days was like a guest who never left, slipping in through our boots, hiding beneath straw mattresses, and whispering through the cracks like a grumbling old man. That's why what we wore wasn't just clothing, it was shelter. Layer upon layer of weary wool, patched linen and hardened leather protected not just the body, but our dignity too. And that dignity, curiously, wasn't measured by how clean someone looked, but by how many days they could hold their composure without slipping into despair. There was pride in endurance, and laughter at oneself was the warmest blanket against the deepest chill. I remember fondly my Uncle Hilario, who always repeated the same joke. If the smell rises, don't run, just rise with it and flip the clothes again. He laughed so hard his shoulders shook like he was sweeping sadness out the door. He was the master of reversals. He'd turn his tunic inside out 4 times, claiming that even the lining of the inside had 2 sides. All it took was courage and imagination, and indeed, he managed it. He was a kind of wool alchemist, turning discomfort into comedy and shame into anecdote. With him, even the smell seemed to have better manners. The children, meanwhile, invented their own rules for dealing with stubborn garments. They created secret contests to see who could go the most days, wearing the same piece without being noticed by the teacher or the keener noses in class. I once won, thanks to a tunic so stiff it creaked whenever I bent my elbows, announcing its presence with ceremonial snaps. That was my moment of glory. 15 days and a discreet nod of respect from the whole group. At that age, being remembered for something beyond poverty was a kind of heroism. And even when warmth finally returned, bringing the first flowers and the long-forgotten buzz of insects, there remained a strange attachment to those clothes. Washing them was almost a rite of farewell, not to dirt, but to an entire season that had shaped us. I remember the scent rising from the buckets, a blend of old smoke, leather, sweat, and dried soup, finally released like a peaceful spirit. We spread the clothes out in the fields, and they seemed to breathe, relieved to return to the sun. Some didn't survive the boiling water, dissolving like fragile parchment. But those that endured came back changed. And even clean, they were never quite the same. When my mother gathered the clothes from the line, she would run her fingers over the fabrics with a tenderness that felt almost religious, like someone caressing the pages of an old book. She said clothing held the memory of cold days and long nights, that every stiffened strand of wool recalled the gesture of someone trying to endure. And truly, there was something sacred in that silence of drying clothes, swaying gently in the wind, like flags from a battle won not with swords, but with hot broth and stifled laughter. In their own way, they were trophies, not for beauty, but for having lasted. Over time, the clothes gained names, stories, even moods. There was the lucky tunic my brother wore on harvest days, the grandmother's shawl, always warm even when torn, and my own winter cloak, which creaked like an old gate but held me with faithful embrace. At nightfall, we folded everything with care, as if wrapping memories for a long sleep. And so, year after year, between layers and reversals, between laughter and smell, we learned that dignity was never in the scent of our garments, but in the strength with which we wore life, even when life arrived coarse and cold. Today, as I remember those nights of bitter cold and inside-out clothing, I see that there was a kind of poetry in it all. Rough, yes, but honest. We had no perfumes or scented soaps, but we had stories stitched into our hems and camaraderie in our crooked seams. No one mocked another because we all shared the same effort, the same scent, the same quiet endurance, and there was beauty in that. A beauty not seen but felt, in the warmth of gathered bodies, in the muffled sound of laughter beneath layers of wool, and in the lightness with which we bore the weight of the season. Sometimes I wonder if it wouldn't be good to relive it for a moment, to turn a piece of clothing inside out with reverence, to feel the cold nudge at the bones, and then find comfort in a fabric worn thin but loyal. Because there is something deeply human in accepting discomfort with grace, in laughing at your own roughness without ever losing tenderness. And if today our clothes are light and clean, what we carry in them is no longer sweat or smoke, but perhaps an inexplicable longing for the time when smelling bad simply meant we were alive, together, and crossing the winter with courage and humor.